Okay, so as you know, your assignment is due next week. Is there any questions about it now that you've had a chance to read it, or is it pretty clear? Looks like either no one read it or it's clear, so that's fine. You'll have a chance to ask me during office hours or something like that as well if you encounter problems with it. Okay, I guess we'll just jump into the lecture then. Okay, so last class we were starting to develop an attack tree for breaking HTTPS, specifically the confidentiality property. Okay, so we're in the middle. We're able to see what's happening, and I'll put the emphasis on the fact that we're already in the middle. So getting into the middle isn't part of the attack tree, but it's just learning what we can see. Sorry, I'm trying to find the actual tree itself. I guess here's a piece of it. And you'll recall that we said that there's three basic approaches. So we covered the first one. So what can we see from outside the tunnel? Now we're talking about breaking into the tunnel itself. Yep.
So you said that there are three strategies.
Yep.
So basically, and the goal is to see what we can observe only from outside, right? But we are essentially targeting all the properties of HTTPS.
Okay. So what we're doing in this attack tree is we're actually only targeting one of them. Okay, so we're going to target the confidentiality property, if you look here. Okay, so we're not going to worry about message integrity. I may mention it in passing as it comes up, but we're not going to worry about it. But if you can break integrity, you might be able to break confidentiality. Okay, so our ultimate goal is to break confidentiality, but if there's a way to break it that involves breaking integrity, then we will consider it as well. So our attack tree isn't meant to capture all the ways to break integrity. It's to capture all the ways of breaking confidentiality, but it might include ways of breaking integrity. So for example, let's say that someone downloads JavaScript not over HTTPS, over HES that can be broken in terms of integrity. That means you have a chance to insert your own JavaScript. And if you insert your own JavaScript, you can also break confidentiality as well, right? So that's an example. Server authentication we'll see a little later today. If I can get the tunnel pointed at me, then all the stuff that comes over the tunnel I'm reading in the middle. So I'm breaking confidentiality that way. So the other two properties, if you can break them, might let you break confidentiality, but the attack tree is specifically for confidentiality. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so then at the end of last class, we said we're going to consider the second sort of cluster of attacks. So these are the attacks where we try to break into the tunnel. Yep. Yep. Do you want me to turn it off or? Oh, sure. I can double check and just make sure. Yeah. So we're going to break into the tunnel, and that involves basically grabbing cryptographic keys. Okay, so if you have these session keys, that's how you make the tunnel. If you can get the keys, you can break into the tunnel. Or there might be other things that you can do without getting the keys necessarily. Well, I'm going to show you a few of those attacks to give you the flavor of how they work. But we're not going to go through the details because it involves a lot of cryptography. Okay, so we mentioned side channel analysis. Also in general, with security, it's something that needs to be considered. We talked about one vulnerability in software called Heartbleed. And last class we mentioned this idea of a downgrade attack. So a downgrade would be you roll back to an earlier version of TLS or SSL that might have vulnerabilities that the current one fixes, or you can try and roll back the kinds of encryption that are used, okay? And more or less all of the versions of TLS had some level of protection against this attack, okay? Basically what you do is you just try to form the connection the best way that you can, and you record or you keep a log of everything that you sent and everything you received. The server does the same thing, okay? And then at the end, once you have your session, what you do is you basically compare your logs. You send your logs over the tunnel. Once you have the tunnel in place, then you send the logs over the tunnel, and then you do this comparison. And then if one of the parties is like, oh, that's not what I said, then you just drop the connection and you tear down the tunnel, okay? Now, it turns out that you can, with these kinds of attacks, you can downgrade the confidentiality of the tunnel, but the protocol wasn't flexible enough to let you downgrade the integrity of the tunnel. So the messages, even in the worst case, had strong integrity. They couldn't be changed. So if you do this check at the end, you have the integrity property, but what could break is the confidentiality property. Anyways, these are details that don't matter. I'm just trying to give you a little bit more color. The most extreme version of a downgrade attack is there's actually a version that uses no encryption at all. And then the second most extreme version of a downgrade attack uses encryption of what's called a 64-bit key. So a 64-bit key is extremely weak. Now you might say, well, why was there even a 64-bit key? Because even when SSL came out in the 1990s, that key was already too weak. There was, I guess maybe 56 bits was it. It was DES. So I think 56-bit was the key. But anyways, there might have been a 40-bit version. The details I lost. But anyways, it's very, very short key, okay? It was weak even by 90s standards. So you could break it with a computer in the 1990s. The reason it was there is sort of interesting. So cryptography was first developed by militaries, and it was used for military application. Then Netscape started using it, saying, oh, we need this on the web too. We're going to send passwords and credit card numbers around. We need this military technology in order to provide safety. And the government said, no, you don't. Okay, no one's going to get in the middle anyway, so you don't need this stuff. This stuff it's military secrets, like how you go about doing cryptography. And we don't want our military enemies to have the ability to do encryption. And so if you put it in a browser, then you're basically giving them the encryption algorithm itself. And then they can start using it for military communications. And that's a world that we don't want to live in. Okay? So what the military did is they actually banned the export of cryptographic algorithms, encryption algorithms specifically, to a whole set of nations that basically weren't part of their kind of Five Eyes, like kind of people that they share intelligence with. So anyone that was outside of that, this is coming from the US, that's where it was being developed with Netscape. You weren't allowed, it's kind of too simple to say you weren't allowed to export it, but exporting it would be similar to exporting a bomb or a grenade or some sort of weapon. There's some red tape involved and it requires approvals within the military system and things like that. So what Netscape did is they said, okay, we're going to create two versions of our browser. We'll have a version for Americans and American citizens, and we're going to have a version for the rest of the world. The version for Americans will have strong encryption, 128-bit, and the export version of Netscape will have weak encryption only, and the government basically said 56 bits is fine. Okay, or 40 bits or whatever it was. That's okay with us. You can export that. Now, what happened is Netscape actually screwed up. So when they deployed Netscape and offered it for download, they actually accidentally offered only the export version. So even people in the US use the export version as well. Now, eventually these laws were overturned. So like the Clinton era in the 90s overturned it, and then strong encryption got rolled in. But because it was there in the early versions of the protocol and the early versions of browsers, some web servers were set up to only accept those. So they couldn't just turn it off. So what you have is, it's still true today, is you have software that's flexible. It can do the old versions of things if that's the only thing that's supported between a client and a server. And you can argue that even if the encryption is weak, you still have message integrity, so it's better than doing nothing. Doing weak SSL is better than doing no SSL. But anyways, that also creates an attack surface, because if I can force your client to downgrade, either by attacking the protocol, the messages that are going back and forth, or I might target your exact software implementation. So there might be some other flaw in your implementation where I can trigger one of these weak ciphers to be used, then I can break your encryption. So there was a recent attack. The names are I kind of got mixed up, but it's in the attack tree. That I think it's Freak was the one that exploited this fact that there were still these export ciphers that are kicking around. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to show you is I'm going to give you the flavor of the kind of cryptographic attacks that have been done against HTTPS. This one's called Crime. I think it's the easiest to understand. You can understand it at a kind of high conceptual level, even if you don't understand the details itself. Okay? All right, so the basic setup is this. We assume that there's a user, and the user has a secure tunnel to some server. Okay? Later, toward the end of the course, we're going to go into a lot of detail about cookies. But cookies are a value that the client knows and the server knows. It's meant to be kept secret, and it's what keeps you logged into a website. Okay, so every time you go back to the website, you send the cookie value. The server looks at it and says, I know who that person is. They gave me their password when I gave them the cookie, so I'm going to honor it as if, I'm not going to ask them for the password, I'm just going to accept that they are who they are. Okay? Yeah, sure. So a cookie is a secret value. The user knows it, the server knows it, and it's specific to that user. Okay? It's actually specific to that user on that device. Okay, so every user has a different cookie. If you're logged into websites on different devices, you'll have a different cookie for each device. The server remembers it. Every time you go back to the server, you send that cookie value. It's kind of like a password, but it just does it automatically. Your browser does it. It's not you typing it in. Your browser remembers it, sends it, and that's basically what keeps you logged into a website. Okay? If I steal your cookie, then I'm logged in as you. Okay, so this is called session hijacking. So stealing your cookie is basically the same as stealing your session. And so now the server thinks I'm you. Okay, so your cookie is more or less a password. At the end of the course, when we go through cookies in more detail, we can think about the nuances between is it exactly the same as a password or not. But it's basically very, very similar to stealing someone's password. Okay, in the threat model, what we're going to assume is the adversary's watching the messages go back and forth, but it's over a secure tunnel. It can't break into the tunnel. Okay, but what the adversary does is, what they have to their advantage is we're also going to assume that they have some JavaScript that's running on the website that's being visited. Okay, so they have some JavaScript. And they can do whatever they want with that JavaScript. And what their goal is not to break the complete confidentiality of HTTPS. In this case, what we're going to do is we're just going to try and recover that cookie value. Okay. Now, I didn't say it explicitly, but I should mention it. The cookie value is sent through the tunnel. Okay. It's not something that's on the outside of the tunnel. It's on the inside of the tunnel. Okay. All right. So Alice is on a website, either that the adversary can, it's either the adversary's website or it's a website that the adversary got some JavaScript running on. Either is sufficient for the adversary. The adversary is also in the middle. They're watching the outside of the tunnel. Okay. Now the adversary with JavaScript, you can't just ask for the cookie. The cookie, it's JavaScript is pretty powerful, but that's the kind of thing that it can't do. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to try and do something else to get the cookie value. And there's a whole bunch of attacks. So Beast was the first one that used this setup. And then they exploited something that went wrong with the cryptography. So it turned out that the block cipher had these initialization vectors that were predictable. That means nothing to you, I know, unless if you've taken 6110, then it might mean something to you. Okay. There's also, when you have block ciphers and you add message confidentiality, kind of like a signature, but it's symmetric key, so it's called a MAC. You add it onto the end. You need everything to be exactly a multiple of 128 or 256 bits. Your messages aren't necessarily exactly that length. So what you do is you add some padding on the end. Okay. Then there's a big controversy of like, how do you MAC the padding, or do you pad it after you MAC? And anyways, earlier versions didn't implement it in a strictly secure way, and so you were able to exploit that. And then there's another stream cipher that used to be supported called RC4, and the way it works is it generates some random noise, and you kind of mask your messages with the random noise. But RC4, the way it was parameterized in HTTPS, it's kind of like an algorithm, and you have to run it a bunch before it starts giving you good randomness. They didn't run it long enough. Okay, they started using it too soon. And so the first bit of randomness you got out of it wasn't perfectly random. Okay, there was some bias in it. And because cookies tend to be at the very start, they're part of the header, they were kind of hitting in that area of the ciphertext where the noise wasn't very good. And if you observed enough of them, you could start doing some statistical guesses at what the cookie value is. Okay, then the fourth way of exploiting this is the one that I'm going to try and give you the flavor of, which is called crime. And the C in crime stands for compression. So compression is going to be the key bit. So compression is can be part of TLS, but generally is not used. There's newer versions of encryption, like protocols that are meant to replace HTTPS, and as well as like TCP and HTTP and HTTPS. They tackle like a bunch of the stack. So there's things called Quick and Speedy. Speedy was used a lot by Google, Twitter, Facebook. I don't think they use it today. I'm not sure on the current status of it, but it was used for a while. And compression was the big feature of it. Okay, so what you would do is you'd first do compression, get the data as small as possible, then you would send it over the wire. Now, when you receive the data, you have to uncompress it. Okay, so it's a trade-off between I'm doing extra computation because I have to uncompress it, but the amount of bandwidth that's being used to send it to me is less. Okay, so you're trading off the amount of space that's required to send data with the amount of computation that someone's doing. Okay, so receiving uncompressed data is good for your computation. It's bad for your bandwidth. Something like Speedy is good for your bandwidth, but it's bad for your computation. And then you have to pick a sweet spot where you're happy, and it's going to depend on devices and things like that. Okay. All right, so the attack works like this. Because Mallory is running JavaScript, Mallory can open up a connection to any website that she wants to. Okay, so she can just open a connection from the JavaScript that's running in Alice's browser, say to google.com. Okay, even if Alice isn't on Google's website, the JavaScript didn't come from Google, it's just some random website with some random JavaScript. The JavaScript can ask for a connection to anything. Now, if Alice happens to be logged into Google, and we're going to assume that that's the case, then her cookie is going to be put into that connection. Okay? So in other words, what I can do is I can open up 1,000 connections to Google, and I'll see over a secure tunnel, I'll see Alice's cookie go by 100 times. Okay? But it's over a secure tunnel, so that shouldn't be a problem. Okay, there should be no problem there. That's what HTTPS is meant to do. It's meant to protect you from someone that's looking at the tunnel. So there should be absolutely no issue there. Okay. Now, another fact is, you'll recall from when we talked about fingerprinting, is that encryption is length preserving. Okay, so what that means is that you have some plain text, you encrypt it, the ciphertext is basically the same size as the input that you put in, the plain text that you put in. Okay? All right. And the third thing is that Mallory, so she'll open a connection, say to Google, the cookie will get put in, and then she can attach whatever information she wants. Like she can say, give me a file with this name. Okay, so that would be a GET request, and she controls that file name. So she can put whatever she wants there. Okay, so Mallory basically is watching this packet go by. It has the cookie that she's trying to hack. It has the text in purple, which she's able to set. She's able to choose that purple text to be whatever she wants. And she can do this as many times as she wants. She can open it 1,000 times, 10,000 times, 100,000 times. Okay? And so what she wants to do is she basically wants to get some statistical information to help her guess what this cookie value is. Okay? She's not going to be able to just open it up and look at it. But what she's going to do is she's going to look for any little scrap of information, because if you get a tiny scrap of information, but then you can repeat the process of getting that scrap of information 10,000 times, you start getting a bigger piece of information, okay? So that's sort of the general approach. So what's a scrap of information that we could get given this setup? So the answer is it has to do with compression. So the way compression works is, let's say I send you a message like, hello, 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 hello. That message compresses easily. I just say hello 10 times, okay? Hello 10 times is shorter of a message than hello, 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 okay? And if you think of it 1,000 times or something like that, saying hello 1,000 times is a shorter expression than actually writing out hello 1,000 times, okay? So that's basically at a very high level how compression works. It looks for repeated patterns in the data, and then it assigns a new symbol to represent that repeated data. It gives you a dictionary that says, okay, every time you see this symbol, just replace it with this other data that's repeated a bunch of times, okay? So data that has a lot of repetition compresses well, and data that does not have any repetition does not compress well. So the extreme form is noise. If you have random noise, there is no pattern there. And random noise doesn't compress, okay? Random noise, if you try and put it through a compression algorithm, you're going to get out something that's the same size as what went in, okay? All right, so what Alice is going to do, what Mallory's going to do is she controls the purple bit, right? So what she's going to do is she's just going to take a guess at what the cookie value is. So she might guess 93A, okay? So maybe she repeats it 5 times in the request. Now, if this string, substring, happens to match something in the cookie, it's going to compress well, right? If it doesn't match what's in the cookie, it's not going to compress as well, okay? Now, the difference is going to be pretty small, but you do it 10,000 times and you look and see, you can measure what the difference is, okay? Now, how does she know whether it compresses well or not? It's encrypted, right? How can she know? Well, encryption is length preserving, right? So if it compresses well, it's shorter. When you encrypt it, it keeps the same length. If it doesn't compress well, it's longer, but when you encrypt it, it's going to be longer, okay? So even though she's outside of the tunnel looking at ciphertext, she can tell how well things are compressing based on the length of the ciphertext that she's seeing, okay? So what she'll do is she'll just start opening up connections. She'll put in random substrings, and then she'll measure, over 1,000, say, connections, whether it's compressing statistically more likely than not compressing. And then as she gets close, as she finds substrings that match the cookie, right, then she knows she's getting close. Okay, then she'll try variations, and eventually she'll try the exact value of the cookie. It will compress very well, and then she's stolen the cookie. Okay, so this attack, that's sort of the high-level view of the attack. This attack is not very realistic in practice, okay? because it requires a lot of the adversary. So the adversary needs to get scripting running on some site that Alice is visiting, so some sort of cross-site scripting attack or something like that. Plus, she needs to be in the middle, okay? You can only steal secrets that the adversary can create, okay? So she's creating these connections, and the connections contain the cookie, okay? So she couldn't steal data that just happens to be sitting on this website, for example, okay? And then there's a lot of trial and error, okay? So you got to try a lot of different things, and so you can only steal small secrets. Now, cookies tend to not be that long. They're a couple bytes long, and so a cookie is something that is conceivably stolen, okay? And then the other thing is that it just looks weird in terms of the traffic pattern, right? You have this website and it starts opening up millions of connections to a web server. And so the chances that your computer notices, because you're running some sort of intrusion detection, your ISP notices, or the server notices. It says, wow, this is a lot of traffic coming from this one IP address. I'm going to block it, right? The chances that you get blocked are high, okay? So crime is kind of a hypothetical, theoretical attack. But anyways, it shows you sort of the depth that people go to. This is like what these attacks are like. So there's a handful of them. There's probably about 10 of them that will end up in the attack tree. I'm explaining this one, but the other 9 have that level of detail. It's sort of like, it's because of encryption and a property of compression and cookies and cross-site scripting, and you're kind of layering, okay? And then eventually you end up with something that actually works as an attack. Okay, so in order to break or subvert the cryptography in the protocol, we can either attack the protocol itself or the implementation of the protocol itself, or we can try and attack the crypto directly, okay? So in terms of attacking the protocol or implementation, we could do some sort of downgrade attack. The downgrade could be a cipher suite downgrade, or it could be a version downgrade. Freak is an example. If you want to do a project in this area, you can look at what some of these attacks mean. It could be an implementation error in the server, such as Heartbleed, which we talked about last class. It could be some sort of side channel attack. So RSA was vulnerable to timing-based side channel attacks. And then in terms of cryptography, Beast, Lucky 13, Poodle, and RC4 biases we didn't talk about. Okay, I just mentioned them. You can see sort of what the flaw is in the protocol that allows these attacks to work. They use the same kind of setup where you have an adversary in the middle also running JavaScript, opening a lot of connections. And all of them leak a tiny, tiny bit of information. But if you look at that information enough and you measure it across 10,000 or 1 million traffic flows, then you can start to build up. You can start to decrypt things statistically. So then crime would be an example of the one that we looked at that uses compressions. The other use biases, the way things are padded, or these things called initialization vectors. Okay, so that's all I want to say about this part of the tree. Are there any questions about it? Okay. All right. So we talked about what you can see from outside the tunnel. We talked about how to break into the tunnel, trying to break the crypto that's involved. The last bit, even though we're 2/3 of the way through the tree, we're only like halfway or less through this whole attack tree, because most of the attacks are going to be in this space of the tree. So what we're going to do in the third thing is we're going to try and get the tunnel pointed at us. Okay? So you'll recall you have a secure tunnel. If you don't know where the tunnel ends, and the tunnel ends at the adversary, then it's almost as good as not having a tunnel at all. Okay? And you only have one end of the tunnel on your computer or in your browser. Okay? So you don't actually know, you can't see where the tunnel ends. You can't see beyond your computer. Okay? So you got to know something about where it ends, right? And what exactly is that something, and how do you come to know it? There's a lot of detail there that makes this protocol like pretty hard to achieve in practice. Okay, so the idea is that I'm the user, I'm putting messages in the tunnel, I can see them going into the tunnel, so I'm happy. But if I don't know where it ends, it might end at my computer, it could end at the Wi-Fi router, it could end at any of the servers between me and the server, it could end just outside of the server, it could be in the middle somewhere, it could get redirected to some completely different server and end at that server, right? So how do I know where the tunnel ends? Okay, actually, let me open that up because I know you guys know at least a little something. Someone's going to say something that's useful. So how do I know where the tunnel ends? Any ideas?
Server.
Okay, so servers, that's fine. How are servers named or recognized?
IP.
Okay, so IP address might be one approach. Okay,
Domain name.
domain name could be another approach.
I mean, you can ping the server and you can see which service the packets are going through.
Okay, yeah, so finding the right server is not that difficult. Okay, so we're going to say that problem is solved. So I can get traffic to Facebook. Okay, the question though is how do I get the tunnel to Facebook? And I guess there's one piece of information that's missing. So let me go through that and then I'm going to flip it back to you. So the tunnel is going to end at, this is a sort of metaphor or a way of thinking of it that's not exactly correct, but you can think of it this way. The tunnel is going to end at a large number called a public key. Okay, so there's, again, it involves cryptography. Everyone that wants one can have what's called a public key. Okay, and if you know my public key, you can send messages to me that only I can read. Okay, and if you know my public key, I can sign things, and if you see them later and you see my signature on it, you can use my public key to verify that I was the one that signed it as opposed to anyone else. Okay, so think of a world where a bunch of people have these public keys. A public key isn't special, it's just it's a large number. It's like a password, just longer and more random. Okay, so it's literally a number. It's not secret, even though it's called a key. Right, the idea of the public part of the key is that it's more like an identifier. It's like a cryptographic identifier. In 6110, you'll learn about public and private keys. There is a private key that goes along with it. Okay, so you get a pair of keys. So one of them's the secret key. That's what you're using to decrypt or to sign. And then your public key is kind of the thing that you give to everyone so that they can do encryption with you. Okay, all right. So if we're trying to go to Concordia, what we need in order to solve this tunnel problem, it's actually really simple. We just need to know Concordia's public key. If we know Concordia's public key, then we can make a tunnel with only the person that has that corresponding secret key. And if it's Concordia, then it's Concordia. Okay? So it's actually a really simple problem. All we need is kind of like a big telephone book that says, here's a bunch of domains or IP addresses, and here's a bunch of keys. Right? And this key belongs to this domain. If we have that, that's called public key infrastructure. If we have that, then this whole problem is solved. Okay? Now, I'm not going to spend a lecture and a half on this, or 2 lectures, if it were that easy. Okay? So it's not that easy. But it's not that easy to make that phone book, I should say. Okay? That's the hard part. But it is that simple of a problem. Okay? So now, again, all I need is Concordia's public key. If I can get Concordia's true public key, then I can make a secure tunnel to Concordia. Okay? So how do I get Concordia's public key? Any ideas? Okay, so can you say more? Or?
Certificate authorities who maintain the certificate records. But
Okay.
always not a good idea because the root certificate can be signed by itself, so it's difficult to maintain a certificate signature.
Okay. So let me start with the basic thing that you said, which is a certificate. So you have a certificate authority. This is someone that issues something called certificates, but let's start with the certificates itself. Okay. So you may have heard of certificates, and they are a part of the puzzle. Okay. So if I can get a certificate for Concordia, then I can get Concordia's public key. Okay. So a certificate is basically, it's like an entry in that imaginary phone book, but instead of there being one phone book where everything's written down, What servers do is they keep their record on the server. So I'll go to Concordia and I'll say, hey, Concordia, I don't know your public key. I want a secure tunnel with you. Can I have your public key? And Concordia will say, no problem, here it is. Okay? I put it in this nice digital format. You can see my domain name is there and my public key is there. I'll send it to you. Now you have my public key, so now you can connect to me. Okay? So far, if we define a certificate this way, is there any problem with this? I go to Concordia, say, I don't know your public key. Concordia says, here it is. Then I make a secure tunnel with that public key.
Yeah, the adversary also knows the public key of Concordia.
Okay, so what if there's an adversary in the middle? What can they do? So they'll learn Concordia's public key. It's not so much about the secret,
Anyone can change the certificate.
but they could change it. Okay, so Concordia says this is my public key. The adversary crosses it out and says, oh, actually, no, the public key is my public key, right? So I get this information and then I make a secure tunnel based on that public key that I received. I think it's coming from Concordia, but I end up with a secure tunnel to the adversary. Okay? So how do we protect it against it? We protect it against it with what are called certificate authorities. So a certificate authority is a company like Global Sign, and what they'll do is they're going to sign this information. Okay, so the server, so they'll take what's in the certificate basically, they'll sign it, and so now if the adversary's in the middle, the adversary can still try and change it, but it's going to wreck the signature. Okay, so that data is not going to be signed anymore, and my browser will reject it. Okay, so the adversary tries to change the value, and then it breaks. They could also try and change the signature, but if they're not Global Sign, they don't know the right signing key that goes along with it, and so they basically can't change any of those things. Okay, is this good enough now? I wouldn't ask it if it was.
So they are also vulnerable to the adversary changing their signature.
Okay, so the signature the adversary can't change without it not verifying, essentially. But you're close.
Signature forgery.
Yeah, so we're going to assume the signatures work fine.
But anyone can sign.
Okay, so let's play with that. So who gets to be a CA? So Global Sign is a CA, right? Can I be a CA? Okay, we're not sure. Okay.
Anyone can, because you can write your own root certificates and you can use the certificate chain.
Okay, sure. So to some extent, you could start acting like a CA, and you could trust yourself to be a CA, but no one else in the world is going to trust you, essentially. Okay. Now let's just walk through this in slow motion. Okay, so I get this certificate. I don't know what Concordia's public key is, so I know I'm going to concordia.ca. So I say, okay, I am going to concordia.ca. Here's the public key. That's fine. It's signed, right? So it's signed by this Global Sign, and I see a signature value. How do I verify the signature? What do I need to verify the signature? Okay, so I need a public key of who? Of Global Sign. Okay, where do I get the public key of Global Sign?
On their certificate.
Okay, so you can see this is sort of circular, right? I wanted Concordia's public key, and we said, oh, Concordia can't tell you its public key because that's not secure. So we're going to use this certificate where Global Sign's going to sign what its public key is. Well, how do I know what Global Sign's public key is?
Yeah.
Aren't I just going in circles?
Some of the CAs are like preloaded in the browser and they are already trusted.
Okay. So the answer will come from that eventually, but it's, yeah. But anyways, that's the question, okay? So how does Alice know the public key of the certificate authority? The CA is basically trying to let us know the public key of everyone else, but you need a public key of the CA in order to do it, okay? then you can ask the question, well, whatever method that Alice uses to verify global sign's public key, why doesn't she just use the same method to verify Concordia's public key? Okay, so if there's preloads and things like that, well, why can't we just preload Concordia? Then we don't even need a certificate authority,
So many websites.
right?
And you have to load
Okay,
every
okay,
domain.
all right. So these are right. Okay, we'll get there. Okay, but anyways, okay. So that's the first question. Then there's a second problem with this, which is Global Sign signed what what their public key was, right? How did Global Sign know what Concordia's public key is?
Because Concordia has to provide like details like I have a domain, I own domain, this is a domain registration, and this is like that public key.
Okay, why doesn't Alice just do the same thing?
Because
Then we don't need Global Sign.
there is two type of certificates authentication, like domain authentication, and one is like personal authentication where you have to submit your identity.
Okay, just say for domain validation. Why can't I just verify it myself?
Because you get a detail on your domain, you have to reinsert the domain details once you own.
Okay. So that not quite right, but it's good guessing. Yeah. Okay. So we'll phrase the question and we'll eventually get around to answering it. Okay. So I'm trying to solve this problem if I don't know what Concordia's public key is. We now have certificates and we have certificate authorities. Looks like we're getting closer to a solution, but now I need to know what the certificates authority's public key is. Okay, I don't know what that is. And also for a certificate authority to sign Concordia's certificate, it had to figure out what Concordia's public key is. Okay? And so however it figured it out, well, I could just do it myself. Okay? So in a sense, it seems like we're not actually getting any closer to solving this problem using certificate authorities. It's just reintroducing the same problem in different forms. Okay? So there are solutions to it, and everyone like sort of hinted at what they are, but we'll go through them one by one. Okay, so how do I know the public key of the certificate authority? So the answer to that is when I go to the Apple Store and I buy a new MacBook, it's brand new, never been turned on, never connected to the internet, it comes in the operating system with a whole bunch of certificate authorities. You can see them here, and they're hard-coded into the operating system itself. Okay, so it just comes preloaded with a whole bunch. How did they get on the list? I don't know. Like they know Apple somehow. There was some sort of business relationship between Apple and them. Somehow they got their certificates on my computer. Okay, so when I get Concordia's website, or I go to Concordia's website and it's signed by Global Sign, I'll find that Global Sign is in this list of certificates that came on my computer. It's true that, so generally speaking, browsers will just use whatever the operating system comes with. So Windows, Microsoft has its own list, Apple has its own list, but the lists are basically one-to-one, okay? And then some browsers like Firefox will come with their own list, okay? So most browsers, Chrome, IE, Safari, whatever the operating system's doing, they'll let the operating system do it. And then Firefox, Mozilla will say, we have our own list that we curated, and so we'll use our own list if you're using Firefox, okay? So for the purposes of this class, we'll just talk about it coming from the operating system, but in some cases it could also come from the browser as well. Okay, so this is the list. If you want to see them, you can, for example, on Apple, it would be in Keychain. And so you can see a bunch of them. Now, I wanted to ask this question before I showed it to you, so you've already seen it. But if you can rewind your mind before I showed you this list, and you just knew that there were some certificate authorities that came with your computer, how many would you think there would be there? Okay, most classes, when I ask this without showing them the list, they say, oh, maybe 10, maybe 5, maybe 3, 5, 10, okay? But you can see from the list, there's a lot, right? Now, some of these are the same, like it's the same company has 2 certificates or things like that. But still, this is like hundreds or like I forget the exact count, but it's like, it will be in a slide, but it's like around 50 to 100 kind of thing. Okay, the second thing about this list is, I know it's too small probably to read, but do you think you know all of these companies? There are companies that you trust, like Apple and Amazon and Microsoft. Okay, and so the answer is no, they're not really. There is Amazon and there is Apple, like they have certificates, but there's also ones called Bypass, Certainly, CertSign, CertTum, CFCA, Cisco, you've heard of, I'm sure, Komodo, ComSign, dTrust, DigiCert. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of CAs that you don't actually know. Okay, do you trust them? That's actually what's being asked of you. Okay, you're being asked to trust these companies because these companies are vouching for the public keys of all the servers on the web. Okay. Okay, so there's maybe about 50 unique companies. Some companies own other companies and things like that. Most of them you probably have never heard of, and there seems to be like way more than we should have. Okay, now why does this matter? If there's 50 instead of 3, who cares? Is there any reason that we should care that there's 50 instead of 3? Okay, so this is the most important part of today's lecture. It's the only thing you absolutely have to remember if you remember nothing else. Any CA can sign a certificate for any site on the web. Okay? You want to go to Google, Google will have a certificate. Google's a bad example. You want to go to Concordia, Concordia will have a certificate. It doesn't matter which of those 50 companies issued the certificate. You trust it equally. Any of those 50 could have issued it. Okay? Now, why is this a problem? Well, if one of those CAs gets breached, okay, there's some problem with how they issue certificate, the signing key that they use to sign the certificates, any kind of issue that allows an adversary to trick them into issuing certificates that they shouldn't, you can issue a certificate for any website on the internet. And then if you're in the man-in-the-middle position, you can intercept traffic to any website in the world. Okay? Now I mentioned, I think I'll eventually get to this, but I'll just mention it now, that Google's a bad example. Google's a bad example because Google is the largest website, and they're one of the largest browsers. Maybe not the very largest, but they're almost one of the largest browsers. And so Google's a little special because they control both ends of the tunnel. Okay, they control the browser end and they control the server end when users who use Chrome go to Google or Gmail or any kind of Google web page. Okay, so what Google can do is they can hard code their certificates and the CAs that they use into Chrome. And if a user anywhere in the world happens to go to a website that spits back a valid certificate for Google that's not what Google is expecting, then it will report it right away and it will phone home with it. Okay, so Chrome didn't always have this functionality, but almost immediately after they turned it on, it was discovered that there were a bunch of fake certificates that were floating around. Some were from a company called Komodo, some were from a company called DigiNotar, and they were for things like Google, Facebook, and people were presumably using them to attack connections to those websites. Okay. Now, the second thing is, let me show you a certificate, and then I'll explain this. So we're on Moodle.com, so this is Concordia. If you want to see the certificate, you basically just click on the lock, and then it will show you the details. Another small detail that will become relevant later is every subdomain has its own certificate. You can get a certificate that covers your subdomains if you want, but subdomains could be unique entities in terms of the certificate. Okay, and so there's all sorts of details in the certificate itself. The public key itself, that secret value, or not secret value, but that critical value will be somewhere near the top. So this is the value itself. So you can see it's sort of just a long random value. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that goes along with the certificate. So there's a lot more in a certificate than just that key value. But for now, we just We just have to care about getting this key value correct. Okay, now Concordia's website is signed by Global Sign, and the Global Sign certificate that signs Concordia's website or their web certificate is not actually the Global Sign that's in my computer. It's a different one. Okay, so what we end up doing often in practice is we create what's called a certificate chain. So what will happen is you'll have a site certificate. It will say Concordia's public key is this value, and you'll get someone like, say, R3 is just a made-up CA to sign it. Okay, they have a signature, and we said in order to verify this signature, I need the public key of R3. So how do I get the public key of R3? Well, I go over to R3 and I say, give me your certificate. Then R3 will say, okay, here's my certificate. You can see my public key is here. And by the way, my certificate is signed by this other CA, ISRG. And then you'll say, okay, well, now I need ISRG's public key because I need to verify this signature. And then eventually you'll chain back to something that's in your computer. So something that's in those 50 files, okay? Something that's in this list, okay? So it's not the case that the companies in this list just directly sign Concordia's certificate with the key that's on your computer. What they'll often do is they'll create a kind of chain, okay? So there'll be a certificate in the middle. And why do they do this? Well, the reason they do it is because these root certificates, you can't see it's too small, but the expiration dates, like for the first one here is 2043, this is 2029, this is 2037, this is 2038. These root certificates don't get changed very often, okay? And you would have to actually update the software, like the operating system itself, to change them. Okay, there's no way really to modify them, okay? So, and they're also very, very sensitive. If you can steal one of these, right? Like I say, you can sign a certificate for any website, okay? And the only way to get rid of the certificate would be to update the software, okay? Now, on the other hand, you have something that's super secret, okay? What you'd like to do with that key that's on the computer, like this corresponding secret key, is you like to put it in a vault, right? Where like 5 people need to sign it and it's behind a bunch of locked doors and you need 10 keys to get into it, okay? Now, the problem with that is if you issue a certificate, Concordia comes along tomorrow and says, I need a certificate signed, you have to go in the vault and get that key because you can't sign it without having access to that key, okay? So you can't put it in a vault. It actually has to be available for signatures, okay? So what CAs do is they create like an intermediate certificate. This one they keep online, and this one will have a shelf life of a year or something like that, okay? So if it gets compromised, it's still a big deal, but it's not as big of a deal as one of the root certificates. So the things that are on your computer are called root certificates. It's not as big of a deal as a root certificate getting signed, okay? So what they'll do is they'll create the root certificate, they'll sign an intermediate certificate that's good for a year, then they'll put the root certificate in a safe. And I think maybe on Moodle, I can't remember if I linked to it, but there's some articles from like Wired where they go to one of these big CAs and they walk you through the procedure of like where it's stored and all the number of people that have to sign and things like that to get access to it. It's very, very high security, okay? And then eventually the intermediary will expire, and then maybe once every year or 2 years they'll get it out of the safe, and then they'll sign a new intermediary certificate with it, okay? Now, the problem with intermediary certificates is that the company that, so we saw an example where the root certificate and the intermediary were the same company, okay? But that's not strictly the case, okay? It could be that Global Sign decides, hey, I am going to make Jeremy Clark a CA. Then what it can do is it can sign me a certificate using its root certificate. And now I have this intermediary certificate. I'm not in your computer. If you look at your computer, you don't see my name, okay? But because I'm in the chain, I am authorized to issue certificates, okay? All right, so how do you see, like we said, there's 50 companies that are on our computers, meaning that we saw the root certificates, we saw that there's 50 companies. And since a root certificate could issue a certificate for a different company than itself, we should ask the same question of how many companies are there in intermediary certificates?
Thousands and millions.
Okay, so maybe it's thousands or millions, but let's focus on how you know that, regardless of what the number is. So how would you get that? Where would you get the number from?
Basically, one root certificate can sign many intermediate certificates, and they assign lead certificates. So if you check any certificate chain, you find many intermediate certificates.
Okay.
So basically, you can predict.
Okay. So is there a direct way to get it? Okay, I can't look on my computer. There's no like really list anywhere. There's a caveat with that where there's this new project called Certificate Transparency that's trying to address this very issue. So we'll use your approach. So if I see the whole chain, then I can see the intermediaries, right? Okay, so how do I get every certificate chain in the world?
To check how many certificates, how many GS are having the publicity of that.
Okay, but I can't check that, right? So all I can check is I can see all the public keys of the root certificates in my computer, but if a root certificate issues an intermediary certificate, there's no one knows it exists until you see it, right? Like it's like, I don't know if one root has issued one certificate or if it's released 1,000, yeah? So it doesn't create an observable event, yeah? Okay, so the only observable event is I actually get the chain. If I get the chain, then that's fine. How do I get every chain? So that's back to the original question. So I can't start at the root and get the chain because the chain isn't stored with the root. So the only time I see the chain is actually when I go and visit a website. And it says, here's my chain. Yeah? So the very first time I see an intermediary certificate is because I went to a website that uses that intermediary. There's no way to start at the root certificate. Then I see that it goes back to a root, right? So basically, I always have to go backwards, okay? So the only way to get every chain on the web is to go to every website on the web. If I can go to every website on the web, I can write down all the chains that I see, then I can write down all the intermediaries, okay? Even then, it might not be complete because some websites might serve up a different chain depending on what country the person's coming from, okay? So I'm only going to see it from my own vantage point. But if we get lots of people around the internet to do it, then we might have a hope of this, okay? Can you visit every website on the internet? Why not? Okay, I don't need to do much. I need to say, give me your certificate, it gives it to me, and then I drop the connection. I don't even have to load the website or anything. Okay, so the answer is sort of complicated. IP addresses, the ones that we use in this class, are technically what we call IPv4. So it's 4 values, like a value dot, a value dot, a value dot, a value dot, a value. Every value can take on the value between 0 and 255, technically, okay? 256 values, so 256 to the power of 4 will give you, I forget what the number is, but it will give you the number of possible IPv4 addresses. And it turns out that you can visit all of them. You can just start 0.0.0.0.0, 0.0.0.1, 0.0.0.0.2. It will take you a week, maybe a couple weeks. Researchers have written super fast software that will let you do it, but super fast means a couple weeks, okay? With IPv6, the address space is way bigger, and you can't possibly exhaustively search it, okay? So what we can do at least is we can go to every IPv4 IP address. We can say, hey, I want to do a tunnel. Do you speak HTTPS? And if they say no, then you just move on. And if they say yes, then you say, great, give me your certificate. You write down the certificate, and then you move on, okay? And so people have done this over time. And what they see is that there's between maybe 200 to 600 of these intermediary subsidiary organizations in addition to the 50 root certificates that you see on your computer, Okay, so you have 50 companies on your computer. There's another 200 that are just in chains, and you don't see them until you visit a website that uses that chain. And at the time of these measurements, which I think are a little bit old, there was about 2 million of the IP addresses had a certificate as opposed to not having a certificate or not having anything at that IP address. There's another project now too that collects every certificate. So basically is like a log. It's called certificate transparency. And browsers are starting to force websites to have their certificates in the log. Otherwise, they won't accept it. But it isn't deployed across all browsers for every kind of certificate. Okay, it's limited to certain kinds of certificates. So anyways, eventually we might have just a big log of every certificate. Then you can see how many intermediaries there are just by looking at the log. Okay, why does it matter that there's 200, 600 different CAs? Like I said, it matters because any certificate can sign, any CA can sign a certificate for any site. And so we have what's known as what's a very common security principle, which is the weakest link, okay? So you just have to breach one of them, and then it brings down the whole system. And it doesn't matter which one you breach, okay? You can find the weakest one. You can visit all of them and try and find one that's vulnerable, and then you can mint a certificate with your public key as the adversary for any website. And if you see a user that's trying to go to the website, you just drop in your certificate instead. Now the user's happy because they think they have a secure tunnel to google.com, but what they really have is a secure tunnel to you instead, okay? Now, if you're a major website like Google, Apple, those types of websites, what you can do is you can tell the browsers, hey, these are my exact certificates, or I only use certificates from this CA. If you ever see something different, let me know. That's fine. If you're a big website, you can do that kind of thing. But if you're a small website like Concordia, or even smaller like my personal website, I can't do that. Okay, so it doesn't scale up to all 2 million, 4 million HTTPS websites. It works for some of the big ones. Now, another thing to recognize is that CAs aren't necessarily a politically neutral company. They're not just necessarily a random tech company. Yeah, question?
Yeah, these intermediaries, are they trusted?
Yeah, so they're trusted more or less the same as a root certificate. So because they can issue a certificate for any website, if you're a hacker and you have the choice between hacking an intermediary or a root, it really doesn't matter. The root's a little harder to change. Like it's harder for people to fix, and you might have like a longer lifespan for your attack. But basically the power that an intermediary or subsidiary has is the same power that a root certificate has. They can both issue a certificate for any website.
So if someone can get a hold of an intermediary certificate, because it's all chain,
Yep.
so they can do the same harm as.
Yeah, okay, so let me be clear because I maybe wasn't crystal clear, but let's look at let's just take the intermediary itself. Okay, there's 3 cryptographic values that are important here. Okay, so you can see that this certificate has a signature. Okay, so think of that as the actual like a analog signature or whatever. Okay, that signature, I can verify that signature came from this public key. So there's an algorithm that says, give me a public key, give me a signature, give me the message that was signed, and I'll look at all 3 of those values and I'll tell you, yes, that signature matches that public key or it doesn't. Okay? So in the certificate chain, signatures are public values. Anyone can see them. Public keys are also public values. Okay? But in order to generate this signature, there's a 3rd value that you're not seeing in the chain, which is the secret key. So it's the secret key that goes along with this public key. Yeah? So when I hack or breach an intermediary or a root, I can steal the signature, doesn't help me. I can steal their public key, doesn't help me. But if I steal their secret key, then that's the thing that we're after. Yeah. Then it helps me. Then I can mint any certificate. Okay, so CAs could be governments. So, for example, Department of Homeland Security in the United States, they had a CA. I don't know if they still do. They could be companies that are aligned with a government, so they might be government funded or part of the military complex or something like that. And some of them could be in countries where the government could compel them legally to give up their keys to the government for government use if they wanted to. Okay, so there's been some controversy around this, and some people believe that certain CAs should be removed based on their ties to government or based on their past behaviors. So one example would be there's a company in the UAE, a cell phone company, and independent of what happened with the root certificates, one time they worked with the government to put malware on phones. Okay, this was discovered by security researchers, and so security researchers, they sort of raised the alarm that this company is government affiliated. Then people realized, oh, this company also has a root certificate, right? And so if they'll work with the government to put malware on phones, how do we know they're not working with the government to intercept secure communications on the web? And so the answer is you don't really know. So then there was a big push from different organizations to get them removed from it. And I think ultimately they were not removed. I don't remember the exact outcome. But anyways, it was there was like articles in the newspaper about it and things like that. Okay, so we've done a pretty good job, I think, of answering the first question. So how do we know the public key of the certificate authority? Well, it's either in our computer or we got it from another certificate, and then that certificate was in our computer, okay? Ultimately, it has to chain back to something that's in our computer, otherwise we reject it. Now, I guess the second part we didn't really answer. Why can't Alice use the same method to determine the key of the website? And so the answer is that you can't put every website's key in your computer because websites change. It's the number of it. So everyone said, well, there's 2 million. That's too many. You could store 2 million certificates in your computer. Okay, it's not. The problem isn't the size of the data. The problem with it is that they change all the time. So there's a new website tomorrow, but you bought your computer last week. So how are you getting that certificate for the website that just came out? One that came out today that was created today. I don't have it on my computer already. Do I have to wait for a software update in order to get it? So the answer is, well, I have a root certificate, right? And that website got a certificate signed today by a company that has a root certificate that's had a root certificate in my computer for the last 5 years or 10 years. Okay, so that's why basically you can't go around and or the way that you verify a certificate authority's key can't be the same as what it is for every website. Okay, so it's a kind of scalability issue and it's a timing issue as well. Okay, now the second question is, Global Sign signs Concordia's website, their certificate, and they say, yes, this is Concordia's public key. How is it that they came to know what Concordia's public key is? Okay, so somehow they know it, but I don't. If I knew it, I wouldn't need a CA. Okay, they know it because they signed off on it, right? And if they have some method or process that they use to figure it out, why can't I just do that myself? Okay, I could just follow their method. And then when I go to Concordia, I'll say, okay, well, I'm going to do the same thing a CA does in order to figure out what your public key is. And then I'm less satisfied with what their public key is, and then I can connect to them. Okay, so think about this for the next 10 minutes. Otherwise, go take a break, go to the washroom, chat with your friends, and I'll answer this question for you after the break. All right, we'll get started again. Okay. All All right, so we'll go to the second issue. So the first issue is, how did we figure out the public key of the CA? We got the public key now, it changed back to something on our computer. Now we want to know is, how did the CA figure out what the website's public key was? And why can't we just do the same thing that they did? Okay, so this was alluded to earlier, but there's actually two different kinds of certificates. There's what's called an EV or extended validation certificate, and there's something called a DV or domain validated certificate. So an EV is probably what you're thinking a certificate is. So what you're thinking is, if Concordia has a certificate, the CA is saying, okay, this is Concordia, it's the university that's in Montreal, its website is concordia.ca, its public key is blah, 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 blah. I'm going to put that all in a document and I'm going to sign it. Okay? So that is a kind of certificate. It's the classical view of what a certificate was supposed to be from when we got SSL in the first place. Okay? There's a big problem with this certificate, which is it takes a lot of time to validate. Okay? So you can't get a certificate like this quickly. And so what happened is over time, the demand for getting fast certificates increased. And so the kind of like the standard for what we verify in a certificate went down. Okay? So now a typical certificate will only validate that the public key matches the domain concordia.ca, for example, but it has no idea, is that Concordia the university, or is it someone else that got to concordia.ca first? It doesn't even try and figure that out. Okay? All it says is the computer that if I type in concordia.ca into a browser, I end up on some computer on the internet, and the public key on that computer is this particular value. Okay? So that's called domain validated. Okay, so an EV certificate basically involves some human level of verification. I can't figure out if it's Concordia and what their address is, just in an automatic kind of way. I need to, check something. I need to make sure the person that's asking for the certificate actually works at Concordia, that kind of thing, okay? So these EV certificates often involve, mailing documents, maybe doing something in person or over the phone, talking to people. They work well if Concordia.ca, Concordia the university is a recognized business in Canada. Okay, it has a registered business name. It's in a government directory. You can look up its address from the directory and things like that. So if I can figure out that you actually work at Concordia, then I can get all the other details from public records that are issued by the government. I trust them because it's the government. Okay. Now, if it's some business that's not registered, right, then what you basically can't get this kind of certificate for it because there's who knows any of the details about it. Okay. Now, the problem with this is twofold. First off, it's expensive because there's some validation of the information. But the second thing is the real big problem of it is it takes maybe 2 weeks. You go to the CA, you send everything, you go back and forth, whatever, you get your certificate 2 weeks later. Okay? Okay. Why is that a problem? Here's why it's a problem. When you get a certificate, it only lasts so long. It has an expiration date. Now they're pretty short, like a year or 2 years. Okay, so let's say I get a certificate for 2 years. I'm a big, successful e-commerce website. I'm doing lots and lots of business. And oops, I forget to renew my certificate before it expires. Okay, so I wake up one day and I have 150 emails saying, your website's not working. When I go there, I get certificate error, expired certificate, blah, 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 blah. Okay, and then I say, okay, I'm losing money, right? Because customers can't buy things. What am I going to do? Well, I have to get a new certificate, but it's going to take 2 weeks, right? I'm going to lose $1 million every day for 2 weeks. I'm going to lose $14 million, okay, because I forgot to renew a certificate, all right? So that can't happen, okay? So the companies on the web will not let that happen, okay? So they say, no, we need certificates fast, okay? We can't do this process, okay? Now, in terms of security, this is pretty high security. Okay, because every detail is being validated. You have a lot of information. When you get one of these certificates, you really know, not just I'm going to google.com, it's Google, the company, and Mountain View. Okay, so these certificates are really nice. They're luxurious. The only kind of vulnerability with them would be some sort of social engineering. Okay, so there is an example of somebody who worked at Microsoft, was fired, and then they still had their credentials and they were mad. So they went to a CA and said, oh, I still have my staff ID and things like that. And the CA believed that they still worked at Microsoft, and they gave them a certificate for Microsoft that had their own public key in it. Now, this technically wasn't for HTTPS. It was for code signing. So code signing is another thing that uses certificates, but it could have been for HTTPS. It's the same kind of principle. And so anyway, so some sort of social engineering is one vulnerability with this. But other than that, it's pretty much, it's pretty secure. Another thing that's just for your own interest is browsers used to tell you whether you're getting one of these good certificates or one of the not so good certificates. Okay. Now they've removed the functionality because users had no idea what was going on. So what used to happen is when you got one of the good certificates, the color green was somehow incorporated. Browsers did it differently. So sometimes the whole address bar would be green. Sometimes it would display the company name and the country it was located in beside the URL. Sometimes, yeah, it would use green. Basically, some combination of green and displaying the actual company name as opposed to the domain. Okay. Now, users didn't know. I mean, they go to a website, they barely know enough to know whether there's a lock there. If the lock's green or if it's gray, was the difference? Who knows? Okay. And so eventually browsers just kind of took this functionality away because it wasn't really helping anyone. Okay, so the solution to can I get a certificate faster than 2 weeks is I can give you a certificate faster than 2 weeks. I just can't check everything that you want checked. I can't check that you are the company that you say you are. I can't check your address and all of that type of stuff, okay? So the only thing I'm going to check, the most critical thing, is I'm just going to check that your domain matches, that you have control over your domain, okay? You say you're concordia.ca. I'm going to try and test whether you control concordia.ca. If you control concordia.ca, then I'll believe it and I'll give you the certificate. So this process, the DV or domain validated process, is meant to be completely automated. So there's no human at the CA that's looking at anything. It's just a machine. Okay? It's going to go through some process, and at the end, if it's satisfied, it will sign the certificate. Okay? So it can basically go as fast as computers can talk to each other. You'll see there is a bit of things that you have to do that a computer will check, but basically it's not quite instantaneous, but it's quite fast. Okay, and as a result of it being faster and the CA not needing a human, they can also sell you one a lot cheaper. Okay, so these are cheaper certificates to get. Just to emphasize, it doesn't include any kind of ID check. It just tries to check whether the user actually controls the domain that they say that they do. Okay, now because these certificates only validate the domain, let's say you go to Google with 3 O's.com, okay? Is this Google Mountain View the company? Well, it's not their main domain. I think they tried to buy up a bunch of domains that kind of look like it just to help with typos. But this could be an adversary's domain, okay? An adversary could control this domain, not actually Google, okay? Now, could the adversary get a certificate for that domain? So they can get a DV certificate because they control that domain. It's their domain. Okay? Could they get an EV certificate that says this is Google Mountain View? No, they can't get that kind of certificate. Okay? So this is why DV certificates aren't as secure for users for you to accept them, is because they're only validating the domain, and it's up to you to know what Google's domain is or what Concordia's domain is. If you go to the wrong domain, it could still have a certificate, and that certificate is perfectly valid. There's nothing wrong with it because the adversary does actually control that domain, and that's all the certificate says. Okay? That's another thing that I should repeat is when you go to a website and you see the lock and there's a certificate, it doesn't tell you the website is good. It doesn't say there's no malware on the website. It doesn't say someone checked out the website and they know that the people that run it are trusted. It doesn't say anything. It just says that you have a secure tunnel and it's ending at this domain. Okay? That's all it tells you. It doesn't tell you anything about whether you should trust the website or anything like that. It's strictly about is my communication to and from this domain secure or not? Okay, so how does a CA implement this? So what does a CA do in order to create a fully automated process that a machine can run to check whether someone actually owns the domain or not? And so there's three basic approaches: email, HTTP or API, and DNS. We'll go through email in a bit of detail, and then the other two are just kind of variants. Once you see the one, you kind of know how the other ones work. Okay, so this is how it works. So I'm going to, well, let's say I'm pretending to be Concordia.ca. Okay, so I go to any CA that I want to, and I say, hi, I'm Concordia.ca. I control that domain. Here's my public key. Can you sign it? Okay, so that's called a certificate request, status request. So I give that request to it. Now what the CA is going to do is they're going to say, okay, I don't know if you control Concordia.ca or not. Who knows? Okay. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick a random number, like kind of like a password, a challenge value, and I'm going to email it to admin@concordia.ca. Okay. Then I'm going to give you a web form, and I'm going to say, if you can copy the secret code that I sent to this email address into the web form, then I'm going to believe that you're Concordia.ca. Okay? Or you could even put it in the URL of the link that's in the email, so the person just clicks on it and then the code gets back. But somehow the code gets back to the CA, and then the CA says, okay, great. This person must be from Concordia.ca. I'm going to sign their certificate. Okay? So it's a pretty simple procedure. It does work. I mean, it's used everywhere. Everyone uses this. Okay? So at some level, it does work. But since we're doing an attack tree, is there any way that you can think of that you might be able to attack this protocol? Okay, so let's start with the email address itself. So spoofing, what does spoofing mean? I know what spoofing means, but like what do you have in mind more precisely?
Asking for the code as the supposed email that should receive it.
Okay. So I didn't explain this well. The fact that it decides to send it to admin@domain.ca is the CA's choice. So it wasn't that I said, hey, send it to this email address. It's like a pre-coded thing that CAs know. And so everyone in the room who has a domain should know that you need to set aside admin@yourdomain.com. That's a special email address, and anyone can get a certificate for that type of thing. Okay. What if you go to Gmail and you say, hey, I'm going to pick my Gmail address. I want it to be admin@gmail.com. Okay. Well, Google needs to know not to give that one out. Okay. What if they do give it out? If they give it out, I can get a certificate for gmail.com. And then I can intercept everyone's email to and from gmail.com. So this actually happened. It didn't happen with Gmail. But it happened with Hotmail or Microsoft Live.com, whatever they call their mail service now, Microsoft's mail service. And the reason it happened is admin the only special username that you have to set aside? Okay, well, we don't know, like, it's up to the CA. So CAs tend to use admin. What if the CA is not in an English-speaking country? Are they going to use admin? What's admin stand for? Administrator, right? What language is that? Okay. Does everyone speak English in the world? Okay. All right. So is it always going to be admin? Maybe not. Maybe in some countries it's another word. Okay. Maybe it's some other English word, but not admin, like host name or host master. Okay. And so it turns out that most CAs had like kind of the same set of names that they set aside that they would use for this purposes. But it just takes one CA to have one name that Gmail or Hotmail doesn't know about, and then you can get a certificate from that particular CA. So there was a CA, and they decided that one of these like special names that they would send this information to would be SSL certificates at your domain dot whatever. And so what someone did is they said, oh, that's weird. I've never seen SSL certificates as like an option. This is probably the only CA out of the 400 CAs that does it. But then they went right over to Hotmail and they said, give me SSL certificates at hotmail.com. And Microsoft said, fine, it's yours. So then they registered it. Then they asked for a certificate for, and actually I think it was live.com, which is Microsoft's new name. And that's significant because live.com isn't just an email service. It's also used to like do code signing for Microsoft updates, and everything in the Microsoft ecosystem goes through that. So they were able to get a certificate basically for all of live.com. And then they disclosed it, and then everything got fixed. So now there's like, I'll show you a list. I have it in a slide or two of all the different kinds of domains that you could use. Anything else someone can spot with what's wrong with this, or ways of attacking it? So it's an attack tree. We're open to anything. It can even be a threat, not an attack. So just like an idea of something that might break.
The adversary might try to take control of the mailbox.
Okay. So what stops them?
The fact that it goes through, like it's encrypted email services.
Okay. So I'm going to pick up on two things you said. Okay. The first thing you said was you could try and control the inbox itself for admin at whatever. So that's, you can think of an email gets sent from the CA, it ends up in the inbox. Okay. So there's 2 points of attack. One is the second thing you said, which is let's try and attack it in the middle. And then there's the let's attack it when it ends up in the inbox itself. Okay. So we'll do both of those. So let's start with the inbox itself. So why can't I log into admin@google.com? I could just go and say, hey, that's my email address.
You need password.
Okay, I need a password. Okay. All right. What if I can get the password somehow? Is there any way of getting a password? Guess it, keystroke logger, malware, right? If I get the password to that inbox, to that email account, then I can get the email. If I can get the email, I can get a certificate. Okay. So even though this is a big cryptographic protocol and we're using proper cryptographic keys, everything actually just comes down to a password in the end. If you can break this one password, right, then you can get a certificate. Okay, you don't need all this fancy cryptography. Now, what about the connection between it? So you said it's encrypted. Is it? Are emails encrypted? Okay, SMTP. Okay. Does anyone have a different opinion? Okay, so SMTP is the protocol for sending emails that goes over HTTP. But is SMTP encrypted? Yes, no, or sometimes?
There is another term, SMTP is.
Okay, so there is a secure version of it, start TLS, which is the header that turns it on. So the answer is it's not actually encrypted exactly. Okay, what ends up happening is we use what's called link-to-link encryption, meaning that instead of having one tunnel from the sender of the email to the recipient of the email, you have a bunch of servers, mail servers in the middle. You have a secure connection between each mail server, okay? But every mail server decrypts it, and then they re-encrypt it to where it's going next. Then that person decrypts it, and then they re-encrypt it to where it's going next, okay? So we say it does not have end-to-end encryption because it's not one big tunnel. It's a bunch of separate tunnels, okay? The second problem with email encryption is it's what we call optimistic. So the problem with it is it goes back to the problem we're trying to solve. How do I know the mail server's public key? Right? Well, maybe they went through this whole email process, but then in order to go through this email process, right, you would have to know some mail server's public key. Like it ends up being a circular kind of thing. So what ends up happening is nobody knows what mail server's public keys are. You just ask the mail server, what's your public key? If an adversary's in the middle, you get the wrong key. If the adversary's not in the middle, then you'll store that public key And in the future, if the adversary comes in the middle, you won't accept it. You'll say, I've already talked to you. I know what your public key is. Now you're telling me it's different. I don't believe you. Okay? So you basically ask for it. If you get the right answer, you remember it. But if you get the wrong answer, then you're screwed. Okay? So we call this, for encryption specifically, it's called opportunistic encryption. Okay? You try and do encryption, you cross your fingers, you hope you get the right key. Okay? It's also the broader security term is called trust on first use. Okay? So I ask for your key, you give it to me. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I'm going to trust it. And if that first use, it actually worked, then I'm good. And if it didn't work, then I'm not good. Okay? SSH is another protocol that works this way. You log into an SSH server, it tells you the key. It's up to you. I mean, you can call the person that runs the server and ask them. But if you say, yes, I trust it, then it remembers it. Okay? So then at least if the adversary comes along later, you're going to catch that attack. Okay? So email is not encrypted. There are ways is there any way to do end-to-end encryption on email? No. Good guess, but no. Or sorry, did you say PGP? Yeah, sorry. Good, exactly right. Yeah. So PGP is the protocol that lets you do it. Okay. There's also one called SMIME. So SMIME is used more in corporate environments. PGP is more the open source thing that people can use. PGP has the same problem. How do you know what people's public keys are? You can't have an end-to-end encrypted email if I don't know what your public key is. Okay. They have a different solution, which is like you have a party and all your friends sign your key, and then you have a directory that lists your key and everyone that signed it. And if I see somebody there and I know their key and they signed your key, then I believe it's your key, kind of thing. But anyways, PGP like kind of died out. Not a lot of people use it anymore. Okay, so anyone else see anything else with this? Okay, we did pretty good. There's a few other attacks, but we'll just go through them one by one. Okay, so this one we mentioned. If I can get access to the inbox, then I can get the email. That can be remote access with a password. It could also be physical access as well, right? So servers are computers and they're somewhere. They're somewhere in a building running, and if you can get physical access to them, you can dump the contents of RAM and you can grab whatever email is sitting in RAM. So for remote access, you could also try and breach the computer too. So you could try and use a vulnerability in the server, or you can try and get the password. You can intercept the email. So as mentioned, it uses SMTP. The S does not stand for secure. It's not secure message transmission protocol. It's simple message transfer protocol. And then there is an option for TLS, but it's link to link and it's trust on first use or opportunistic. So you don't actually know what anyone's public key is. You just trust the key that they tell you the first time. We wrote a whole paper, if you're interested. We talk about PGP and why it failed, and we talk about different attacks on email, and we try and figure out why after 30 years or 40 years, actually 50 years, we still don't have secure end-to-end email. Okay, another thing you could do is you could try and guess that secret value that the CA sends over email. If you guess it right, then that's fine. That's easy to fix. You just have to choose a long challenge. Okay, it's got to be, I don't know, 8 characters long, 10 characters long, 12 characters long, that type of thing. We mentioned this so that everyone has to know that a min has to be set aside. It's a special email. You can't just hand it out to any user. And there's lots of other special emails for it. So this was the news story about the guy who got SSL certificates at live.com because there was one certificate authority that used SSL certificates. It was kind of a weird name to send these challenges to that nobody else really realized a certificate authority was doing. I went around saying, is there a list somewhere of all of these domains? And it turns out there is no list. So there's no guidance from the CAs or the browsers or anyone like that. But people kind of went to all the different CAs, and they wrote down the names they saw and things like that. So they have, online, they have a pretty good list of different things here. And then some people said, hey, that looks like a nice list. There's like 20 things in that list that you should set aside, but you missed a couple, and we did a better job. So we have 1,250 different domain names that may or may not be used somewhere in the world by some certificate authority, and you really need to set aside all of these and not hand them out to your users. So if you are interested in that list, you can go look at it. But okay, here's another one. So you send the email to admin@concordia.ca. All right. It ends up in the inbox of the mail server for Concordia. How did it end up there? How did the email actually traverse from the CA's, email client to the right server on the internet? DNS, okay? So how do I know the IP address of the mail server that's collecting email for Concordia.ca? I go to DNS and I say, I want the IP address for the mail server. So your domain record could have a couple different IP addresses. There's a special place called the MX record for mail exchange, and that's where you would put the IP address of your mail server if it's different than the address of where you would go to get the website concordia.ca. So often they're going to be different machines, okay? All right, so that's fine. What if I can change that MX record to point at my IP address? What happens?
You get the email from the
Okay. So I'll get the email instead. Okay? All right, so that's an attack. Can I just go change the MX record for Concordia.ca?
For that you have to compromise DNS server.
Okay, so I could try to attack DNS itself. Whose DNS am I attacking?
Domain control provider. Domain control panel.
Okay, but sorry, between the user, let's say a user is going to Concordia.ca, Concordia itself has DNS, the CA has DNS. Whose DNS am I, whose DNS am I compromising?
The immediate DNS.
Okay, so it's not your ISP, it's not the user,
Recursive DNS server.
it's going to be the CA because the CA is sending the email. Okay, so the CA, in order to send the email, it has to get the DNS, okay? CAs, do they have good DNS, do you think, or not? I mean, anyone can run a DNS resolver, right? Do you think DNS isn't important enough to what they do that they would run their own resolver? The answer is yes, probably. Okay, they probably run it. They probably run DNSSEC. They probably do everything. Okay, so attacking the DNS server of the CA is possible. It should go in the threat tree, but it's more on the hypothetical stance. Okay, is there any other way to get the MX record changed? So the DNS can lie to you about the MX record. That's one way that it could get changed, okay? But how did the MX record get set in the first place? How did DNS figure out what the IP address of the mail server of Concordia.ca is? Sorry, the
Request by Concordia.
yeah, okay, exactly. And when was that request made?
When you got the IP address,
Okay, when they got the domain. Yeah. Okay, so you buy a domain, you buy it from someone and you register it, then they say, okay, what's your IP address, what's all that stuff, you fill it in. Okay? Now you can change it later. Okay? If you want to change it later, who are you going to change it with? The person you bought the domain from. Okay? So I go to GoDaddy, I buy the domain from GoDaddy. Now I have a username and password with GoDaddy. Anyone that can log into that account can change my domain name. Okay? So again, how does the adversary change the MX record for Concordia.ca? Well, again, if they can get that username password, in this case for the DNS registrar, or they can use social engineering or something like that to convince the domain registrar that they're Concordia.ca, then they can change that MX record. They change the MX record, the email comes to them, then they get a certificate. Okay? So all this certificate stuff, it also relies on the security of DNS. Okay? You can break email, you can compromise HTTPS. You can break DNS, you can also compromise HTTPS. And we'll see a specific social engineering attack later when we talk about social engineering on DNS. It is possible, it has happened. The purpose of it was to reset a password, not to steal a certificate, but it could have been to steal a certificate. Okay, now there's two variants to email that are kind of the same, so I won't go through them in so much detail. Instead of receiving an email at, like, say, admin@concordia.ca, all I do is I put up a resource, like a text file, on Concordia.ca's website, okay? And then I put the value of the thing that I want them to sign, which is called the certificate request, okay? So I put my public key there. I go to the CA, say, hey, I'm Concordia.ca. I want you to sign my public key. The CA says, okay, I'm going to go to Concordia.ca's domain, and I'm going to check whether their key is sitting in crs.txt. And if it's there and it matches what you're asking for, then I'll sign it. Okay, if it's not there or there's something else there, then I'm not going to sign it. Okay, so it's more or less the same attack. It sidesteps the email thing. So all your email attacks aren't going to work on this, but the rest of the attacks will. If you compromise DNS, then you're going to the wrong domain. Then the adversary puts a text file there at their IP address instead of the real IP address. Okay. And then in addition, there's maybe a couple other attacks. So just like you could go to Gmail and try and get SSL certificates at Gmail, there are some websites on the web that let you, they're web hosting websites, right? So if you can get a file hosted in the right location on that website, then you could potentially get a certificate for it, okay? So anyway, that's a new one. Oh yeah, and then this is good too. The text file, I should actually update it. When the CA goes and they go look at this text file, they actually go get it over HTTP as opposed to HTTPS. Okay, so first off, why? Why wouldn't it go over HTTPS? Okay, it could go over HTTPS and get this text file. If it did, what would the domain have to have in order to serve that text file up over HTTPS? It would have to have a certificate. What are we doing? What are we doing right now? We're trying to get a certificate, okay? We're getting a certificate because we don't have one, probably, okay? Now, there might be a corner case where we have a certificate, we're just renewing it, so then we could serve this text file over HTTPS with our old certificate in order to get a new certificate, okay? But the CA can't assume that, okay? It wants to sell certificates to people that don't have certificates yet, so it's going to go fetch it over HTTP. It has no choice, okay, if the person doesn't have a certificate yet. What's the problem here? Okay, the adversary's in the middle. What do? They just drop their own text file in and send it, okay? So you go to the CA, you say, I'm Concordia.ca, here's my key. You see the CA go out to Concordia.ca asking for this text file. Maybe it doesn't exist. Doesn't matter. You're in the middle. You just say, yeah, this file does exist. Here it is. And you send it to them. Okay? If HTTPS was turned on, you couldn't do that attack. But because it's over HTTP, it has to. So you can man in the middle the HTTP connection. You can try and attack DNS. You can try and guess passwords of DNS registrars. You could try and guess passwords that control, like the machine that's running the website. If you can break into that machine or get remote access to it, then you can put that text file there. So it's basically the same kind of set of attacks, but it's slightly different. And then DNS is actually the most direct way of doing it. Usually people don't use this because it's a lot easier. If you're non-technical, you can do the email validation. CA sends you an email, you click a link, and then it's done, right? The DNS thing is a little more messy because you have to go. But basically what you would do is you would say, here's my public key that I want a certificate for, and you would actually put it in your DNS record. Okay, you put it in the text field. Then you'd wait 3 days for DNS to update, right? And then the CA would go and they would fetch your DNS record, and then they would see the certificate there, and they would see that it matches it, or maybe it's a hash of it, and then it would issue you the certificate. Okay. So this is probably the cleanest thing because you're not going to websites, you're not going to email. For 1 and 2, you also need to go to DNS anyway. So you're already relying on DNS for the first 2. So in this case, why don't you just do it directly in DNS? And the only answer is it's hard. People are nervous to go and change their DNS records, and it takes a couple days to propagate, and you have to remember your password and account information for your domain registrar and things like that. So it's just logistically a little harder for the person asking the certificate if they're not technical, whereas the email loop is a lot easier. So the email thing tends to get preferred. Now, how would you attack this? You could attack it by attacking DNS. So you attack the record or the username and password that protects the record. You could try and man in the middle the CA talking to its own DNS. Okay, man in the middle works on DNS unless if DNSSEC is used, but not everyone uses DNSSEC. Now in this case, you have to be really close to the CA, and the CA is probably running its own DNS resolver anyways. So this attack seems not as likely, but it's technically possible. But anyways, yeah. So you have a similar set of threats, but there's less of them in this case. Okay, so this answers the question. So we said, well, how is it that the CA figures out what Concordia's public key is? Okay, and so the answer is either they did this in person, phone call, registered mail thing, and gave them an EV certificate, or they did one of these email loops, HTTP loops, or DNS loops, and gave them a domain certificate. Okay. Now the second question is, if DigiNotar can figure out what Concordia's public key is, why can't I do it? If I can do it, then I don't need DigiNotar. Okay. So why can't I use the EV method to figure out what Concordia's public key is? It's kind of a dumb question, but why, if 2 million people go to concordia.ca, why can't Concordia send all their business documents to the 2 million people and then try and prove to them and talk to them on the phone and convince them that they are Concordia and this is their key value, right? It just doesn't scale, right? You can't do it. It's better to have one company do it once, then the certificate lasts for 2 years, and then no one else has to do it, okay? Now, what if I went to concordia.ca and said, hey, I've never been to your website before. I need to know your public key. And Concordia says, this is my public key. And I say, I'm not sure. Maybe you're an adversary. So I'm just going to send a quick email to admin@concordia.ca. And if you can respond to that, then I'll believe that this is your public key. Could every user do that? No. I mean, technically, yes, they could, but it doesn't scale. Right? It's just, it would be a ton of email. You get an email every time, and then you'd have to wait for the loop to complete. Okay? What about the DNS method? So I want to go to concordia.ca. I don't know what their public key is. I have to get their DNS IP address anyways. So I have to go to DNS anyways. What if their public key is just sitting in their DNS record? So I grab DNS. It says, here's the IP address. By the way, here's their public key. And then I'm like, okay, done. I don't even need a certificate from concordia.ca. What's wrong with that? CAs do it. CAs do it for websites, so why can't I do it? Does it scale? It scales because I'm already getting the DNS record. Okay, there's zero extra communication. Okay, it's exactly the same. So why do we need CAs? Why can't everyone just put their keys in DNS and be done with it? So the answer is maybe not what you expect. It's actually that it does work. There's actually not a big problem with it. Okay? There's only one problem with it. The problem with it is you might get man in the middle asking for the DNS record. Okay? If you get man in the middle asking for the DNS record, then the adversary can drop in their key instead. Okay? Aside from that, it actually works. And so how could we stop people from getting man in the middle checking DNS? Well, we could use DNSSEC, or we could use DNS over HTTPS or something like that. Okay? And so people are working really hard on trying to make DNS have integrity maybe confidentiality as well, but at least integrity between the user and the DNS resolver. And if they achieve that goal, so far it's just sort of not been widely deployed. But if in the future, in the next 5 years or 10 years, we're getting all our DNS records over HTTPS, guess what? Everyone will just put their public key in DNS and we won't have all these CAs. That whole problem will just completely disappear. Okay? All right, so why can't Alice use the same method? Well, for efficiency, it's usually better for a CA to do it once and then every user, instead of every user doing it. So that applies to all the methods except for the DNS record. And the DNS thing, like I say, it works. It's scalable. We're already checking DNS already. The only concern is that the DNS, when we ask for DNS things, we don't get it signed unless if we're using DNSSEC or some other sort of secure version of DNS, okay? So if we have secure DNS, then everyone can throw their key in DNS records. This is called DANE, so that's the name of the protocol that specifies exactly how that would work. And we can turn DANE on at any time, we just need secure DNS, all right? So this whole lecture, part of the lecture that we talked about, it might all disappear in a year or 2 or 3 if we can get DNS. Now, there's actually one additional problem, which is if you use DNSSEC as your solution, why can't, if I get a DNS record over DNSSEC, why is it that the adversary can't change it? Any guesses? What's stopping the adversary from changing it? So the answer is the record is signed. Okay, there's a digital signature on it. That's what stops the adversary from changing it. But wait a minute, if there's a digital signature, someone signed it, they have a public key, how do I know what their public key is? Okay, so now we're back in the same old story, okay? Now for DNSSEC, they actually solved it a completely different way. They said there's 2 public keys and everyone has them. One's VeriSign and the other's ICANN or something like that, I forget. And so all of DNSSEC is signed with, they might have chains or whatever, but they all trace back to 2 roots, okay? So it isn't this huge mess where there's tons and tons of CAs. It was controversial because VeriSign is now in control of DNS. You can think of it that way. It's a huge advantage to them at the detriment of all the other CAs that wanted to be it. But anyways, it also has a PKI. It also has roots that are in your computer, but it's much more sane because there's only 2 companies, but then it's a greater concentration of power into organizations, I should say. ICANN's not a company. Okay, so what are some of the lessons learned so far? So the first thing is that certificate authorities are not actually authoritative over the information. So if your name is GlobalSign and you're a company, you actually have no idea what Concordia's public key is, okay? It's not like, oh, you're the company that knows what Concordia's public key is. You just know it. You have no special insider information. You're going to use some method to try and figure out what their public key is, okay? But it's not something that you inherently knew, okay? The only advantage you have over anybody else that would use the same method is maybe that you've been doing it for 20 years, so you're really good at it, okay? But you're not actually authoritative. You don't have any special knowledge. You're just trusting that DNS works right, that if you send an email, it doesn't get intercepted, and all the mail servers have the right keys, and you can fetch things over HTTP, and it's not going to get man in the middle. Okay, you're putting all your trust in these existing internet protocols. There's actually nothing special about what you do in terms of issuing DV certificates, anyways. The other thing is that I mentioned this already, but HTTPS was meant to use true cryptography, like. This model of using passwords everywhere, security people don't like it, passwords aren't secure. Well, at least with HTTPS and locks and all of that stuff, it's using true crypto, right? But at the end of the day, it's not really using true crypto because there's a couple key passwords that if you could guess, like the password to the mailbox for admin@domain.ca or the password to the DNS, the GoDaddy account for domain.ca, if you can guess those passwords, then you can thwart all of this cryptography. You can completely subvert it, Okay? All this crypto doesn't mean anything, all of these keys, if you can get one of those two passwords. Okay? So as much as we wanted to build a model where we're not using passwords, at the end of the day, it actually just comes down to passwords and other protocols and assumptions about them working correctly. Okay, so here's a bit of the attack tree. We're not done yet. We still have another whole lecture, and a half or something. I don't know. But anyways, we can start filling in some of this tree. So all the attacks that we looked at were, I want to intercept traffic between the user and Concordia.ca. I'm going to do it by getting the tunnel pointed at me. And the way I'm going to get the tunnel pointed at me is I'm going to get a real certificate for Concordia.ca even though I'm not Concordia.ca. Okay? If I can get a certificate for Concordia.ca, then I can drop it in the middle and then the tunnel can end at me. Okay? Now, there might be other attacks where I don't try to get that real certificate. Maybe I try to use a fake certificate or something like that. So that's what we'll talk about next. But for now, these are all the attacks where you get a real certificate. How do I get a real certificate for Concordia.ca if I'm not Concordia.ca? Okay, I could hack a CA. Okay, so it's happened before, DigiNotar, Komodo. You have a couple hundred CAs, find the weakest one and try and get a certificate. You can try and subvert how they're issued. You could say, well, I know they're issued over email, so I can do any of those attacks that we just went through. Guess the email password, intercept the email, attack DNS, obtain a reserved email address, change the MX record for the domain email. Similarly for DNS or HTTP GET requests. Okay. If it's an EV certificate, first off, I don't need one. I just need a DV. I don't have to get an EV certificate, but maybe I could still get an EV certificate through social engineering or something like that. If the CA is in a country and I'm the government of that country and I have legal control, I could compel them to. Okay, so that's not even a technical attack. That's like a political attack. There's another thing that we didn't talk about. I don't have slides for, but this is what happens in companies. So a lot of companies, like say Concordia, wants to check all the HTTP traffic coming from Concordia computers in labs and stuff around the campus. Okay, can they do it? And so the answer is they can't, because that's what HTTPS protects against. Okay, but because they control the endpoint, which is the computer, IT, they put stuff on this computer. Okay, what they could do is they could install their own CA root certificate in this computer's certificate store. Okay, so this computer has all the root CAs that come down with Microsoft Windows. Okay, and then Concordia just throws an extra one in, which is their own. Okay, now what they do is every time someone goes, say, to google.com, they mint a new google.com certificate out of thin air. They sign it with their own certificate. Their own certificate is trusted by this computer. It's not trusted by my laptop because that's mine, but it is trusted by this computer because they touched this computer. And then they're able to intercept traffic. Okay, and so that's how corporate environments work. There's technology, middle boxes that do this, that are fully automated, and they do this for you. And then what happened is people went around to these security conferences and they started talking to the people that are selling these boxes. And these people were bragging that, hey, we have these boxes and you don't actually have to go around and change all the computers in your organization. They'll just work. And so the security researchers were like, that doesn't make sense. I mean, how is that possible? And so what had turned out to happen is that a CA, one of the root certificates, had actually issued these companies a certificate that they're installing on these machines and then they're selling to people. So they actually had a real certificate. And that real certificate was capable of doing man-in-the-middle attacks on any particular website. So anyway, so those companies, once it was discovered, then the CA, like Microsoft, Apple, Mozilla, they all got rid of those companies and kicked them out of the list of CAs. So anyway, so you can either, if you're able to get one of these certificates, you could do it, or you can actually control the people's computers. AV software works the same way. Like say you're downloading malware. what some AV software will do is it will actually put a root certificate on your computer, and it will man in the middle all your connections within your own computer. Okay, so you think you're downloading this file from Google, it's actually going to the AV software, the tunnel ends there, they're decrypting it, then they'll re-encrypt it and send it to your browser, but they're in the middle of all your connections. Parental control software, like if you put it on the computer to see what your kids are doing or that type of thing, it works the same way. There's a lot of danger with that because when the software is in the middle, all I see is my tunnel to the software, but I have no clue what the software is doing from the software to the server. And if it's not setting up those tunnels correctly, I have no indication of it. And so actually a colleague, Professor Menon, who you might have at some point for 6120, he did a whole research study where they looked at like 50 of these different parental control software and AV software and looked at how they handled SSL, and they found all sorts of problems with how it was used. Okay, so let's recap what's happening, and then we'll explore a couple other avenues. So let's assume now that everything works right. So let's assume that I go to concordia.ca, and I'm actually talking to Concordia. They have a certificate. There's nothing wrong with the CA system. Okay? So what I do is I go to Concordia and I say, hey, I want to talk HTTPS. You talk it. They say, yep, no problem. Here's my certificate. And it comes back. Okay? And there's an adversary in the middle, and they can try and do whatever they want. Okay? Once I have the certificate on my computer, I'm going to check a couple things with the certificate. Okay? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check that it's signed by a CA, and then I have the chain of certificates that lead back to something that's in my root store. Okay, so I'm going to check that signature chain. Now, how do you get the whole chain of certificates? We didn't explicitly answer it, but it's actually on the website to send you the whole chain. Okay, so it's not that you get it and then you have to go to all the intermediaries and get the intermediaries. They just send you the whole chain. Okay, so you either get the chain or you don't. And then you just have to check that the chain is intact and that it also is ultimately signed by something that's on your computer. The next thing is the certificate has concordia.ca. I'm visiting concordia.ca. It's kind of an obvious thing, right? But you should make sure that they're the same, right? An adversary could drop in, like say they control evil.com. They see you going to concordia.ca, and they just drop in their certificate for evil.com. It is a valid certificate. It is signed. They do control that domain. There's nothing wrong with certificate. The only problem with it is that it's for a completely different domain than you're visiting. Okay, so you got to check that. Another thing is you might say, okay, let's say I go get a domain for concordia.ca. Why can't concordia.ca take their certificate and sign a certificate for google.com with their own public key? Okay, if they do that, there is a chain, right? That certificate signed with Concordia's certificate, and Concordia's certificate chains all the way back to a root, right? So that certificate that they just made up and signed with their own certificate, it's part of a valid chain of certificates, and it does chain back to a root. So what stops you from doing that? So the answer is that when you get a certificate for a website, there's a flag in the certificate that says whether this certificate is authorized to issue new certificates or not. It's called the CA flag. Okay? So your root certificate will have that flag turned on. Your intermediary, what makes them an actual intermediary certificate is that flag's turned on. Okay? But when they issue you a certificate, that flag better be off. If they do it by accident and they give it to you with the flag turned on, guess what? You're now a CA, and you can issue a certificate for any website you want. Okay, so CAs can only sign, they have to try to only sign certificates where that flag is turned off. Otherwise, there's going to be problems. So this is what it looks like. So here's concordia.ca's certificate. If you scroll all the way through it, you'll see there's an extension called critical. There's a certificate authority, and it says no. And then for the intermediary that issued it, you can see that the flag is set to yes. Certificates don't last forever. Okay, so they eventually expire. So another thing you want to check is whether it's still in the expiration period or not. And the last thing is, what happens if someone breaks into your server and steals your key? So now they control your certificate. What do? You're Concordia. You wake up one day and you check your logs of the server and you see that somehow someone was able to use an exploit. They dumped the contents of your computer and they now have your key. So they're running around with your key and they can use your certificate, your actual valid certificate, and they can decrypt everything that's sent over a tunnel to that certificate. What do you do about it? Okay, so we need some way to revoke or cancel a certificate. All right, so that's another thing. So when we get a certificate, we're going to check whether it's been canceled or whether it's been revoked, and that's going to be a whole thing about how we manage to do that, but we'll get there. Okay, so these are all like really basic sounding checks that you should do, and I wouldn't make such a basic list if there weren't some problems with it. So I'm going to tell you some stories about basically all of them and how things went wrong with all of them at some point or another. Okay, so we'll start with one. This is a security vulnerability. It's called go-to-fail. When it happened in 2014, it's kind of like Heartbleed, where it was like all over the news. Not just like tech news, but like CBC or whatever would have articles about this bug. It was a pretty big deal. So this bug was in Apple. It was in their secure transport SSL library, which is on computers, on users' computers as opposed to servers. So Heartbleed was on servers. This is a client-side vulnerability. Anyone that's running Apple's operating system, their SSL uses this particular library. They were all vulnerable to this. And it was a pure software thing. So there's nothing wrong with the SSL implementation itself or the protocol. It was just there was a bug in the software itself. The bug is kind of fun to explain, so I'll try and show it to you using very, very high-level pseudocode. Okay, so what we do, this is the way it worked. We have a variable, and we're going to do a bunch of checks, okay? And if the check passes, we're going to keep the variable at 0. And if a check ever fails, then we're going to set that variable to 1. And then eventually at the end, or you'll see, but eventually if it's 1 at the end, then we know there was an error and we're not going to let the SSL connection go through, okay? All right, so the way it's coded up is you have a bunch of conditions that are being checked, okay? And sorry, this always confuses me. I have to just remember the zeros and ones always throw me off. Okay, all right, I got it. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to check a bunch of conditions. 1, 2, 3, 4. What are the conditions? They're this kind of stuff. Okay, all the things that you need to check about a certificate. You're going to walk through all those checks one by one. Instead of naming them explicitly, you're going to check them. Okay. Now the condition is actually going to write into the check variable. Okay, and it's either going to return a 0 if it passes, or it will return a 1 if it fails. Okay. Then you're going to check whether it returned a 1. If it returned a 1, you're going to run this line go-to-fail. And if it didn't check a 1, you're going to skip the line go-to-fail, and you'll go to the next line. Okay, so the next line will check condition 2. It will either write a 0 or a 1 into check. Then you're going to ask whether check contains a 0 or a 1. If it contains a 0, you're going to skip over go-to-fail. If it contains a 1, you're going to go-to-fail. Okay? What does go-to-fail mean? What it does is it says, if you hit this line of code, it says go all the way down to this like fail, and fail will return check, which will be contained. You won't get to fail unless well, actually, I shouldn't say that. In the case that one of these conditions fail, you'll jump down to fail. You'll skip the rest of the checks. Why are you skipping the rest of the checks? Well, if it fails on the second one, who cares about the third, fourth, and fifth? Okay, so you're going to skip over all of them, and then you're going to return the check status, which will be a 1. Now, it's also possible you make it all the way to the end of the code and none of the conditions fail. Then you'll still hit this fail line, but in this case, check is going to contain 0 and you're going to return 0 instead, which means that it passed. Okay? So if it ever fails, you jump directly to the end, and if it passes all the checks, then you hit the end and you return the fact that it passed. Okay, is there any problem with this code that anyone can see? So go-tos are like kind of, people don't like them for security reasons, but that's not the problem.
Default value of check.
Okay, not that.
You can skip other condition to check.
Okay, not that. Sorry, I tricked you. This code's actually fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Okay, trick question. This code's fine. No problem with it. The problem isn't that, the problem's not with this code. The problem is that this wasn't actually the code. Okay, the code that was in Apple was very, very similar, but slightly different. It just had an extra go-to fail somewhere in the middle. Okay, I don't know why. It's probably a typo. Someone was copying and pasting from somewhere else. They accidentally put it in. Who knows why? Okay, what happens now? Okay, let's say that we pass condition 1. Where are we going?
Check condition 2.
All right, let's say we pass condition 2. Where are we going?
Now you will go.
Okay, so if statements, if they don't have curly brackets, right, it basically tells you whether you skip the next single line. Okay, so if it's true, we're going to skip the next line. Or sorry, if check equals 0 equals 0 is false, meaning that check is 0, then we're going to skip this line. But if this were in curly brackets, the 2 go-to fails, there wouldn't be a problem. Okay? The problem is we always are going to hit this go-to fail, okay, because we only skip the first line. We hit go-to fail, and then we always go down to fail and we return check. Now, let's say condition 3 fails. There's something wrong with condition 3. What happens in this code?
Still you can get access because it's recursive.
Okay, we never hit that line of code. We pass condition 1, we pass condition 2, we go to fail, and we return check, which is saying that we passed. Okay, so the code thinks we made it all the way to the end, okay, but we're not making it all the way to the end. We're making it just to the first 2, and then we're always skipping over the last 3 and 4. The last 3 and 4 are unreachable code. Okay, you can't reach it. There's no possible path to reach it. Now, let's say that condition 3 was like, hey, does the domain that the user is visiting match the domain that's in the certificate? Okay, that's what condition 3 is. What's happening in this library? It's never checking that condition. What does that mean? It means you get a certificate for evil.com, you see someone going to google.com, you just drop your certificate in and say, this is Google's certificate. And it never checks that evil.com and google.com are not the same domains. Okay? It thinks it's great, it accepts it, and you get the connection. All right? So this ended up being unreachable code. Condition 3 was exactly that. Does the domain match the domain? And so any certificate you had, you could use on any SSL connection and terminate it if the user was using Apple. Now you could say, well, how do we fix this? Everyone should write better code. You should double check your code. Yeah, that's true. A bunch of people said, hey, throw a static analysis tool at this, and it's going to find that this is unreachable, and it's going to say alert, alert, alert. Okay? It's actually true. Now, you think Apple doesn't do static analysis? Right? They do. Okay? So what's the story here? Is it that it's not catching this? Or is it that Apple doesn't do static analysis? Right? The truth is actually probably Apple does do static analysis. The static analysis tool does catch this, but somehow Apple's not, they're ignoring it. Why are they ignoring it? Because the static analysis tool, in addition to checking this actual vulnerability, is catching 1,000 other things that aren't vulnerabilities. Okay? So if your static analysis tool doesn't only catch vulnerabilities, if it pulls in a bunch of false positives, then who has the time to go through all the false positives? Okay? So that was kind of the problem with static analysis at the time, is it would flag that, but it would flag 100 other things that weren't vulnerabilities, and so it ends up being kind of a useless tool. Unit testing is what you should have done. You should have tried to throw in a bad certificate and then when it passes, be like, oh, something's wrong, and then reverse engineer it, okay? So that was sort of the academic output, was we need better unit testing. And yeah, that's the story of go to fail. Any questions about that? All right, so good luck with your assignments, and I'll see you next week.